Hi, Sachsenhausen. Polonia gwarna, parna, Germania richtig dicker Heil. Sachsenhausen. Wirtycie jak bambusik, trupie łebki to kaktusy heil. Es lebe kule to Kampf.
Welcome to Descendant Stuff, a podcast by and for the descendants of Sachsenhausen prisoners, working together to uncover the unanswered questions of its history. Sachsenhausen was a Nazi concentration camp located in Oranienburg, Germany, used from 1936 through April 1945. It was used as a labor camp, with a network of subcamps and worksites around the region, as well as a prison camp, death camp, medical experimentation center, and SS training ground. It was also the administrative center for all Nazi concentration camps. We are Jakob, Kelsey, and Nicole, three descendants of Sachsenhausen prisoners. Though our relatives were imprisoned for different reasons, we've discovered we have much in common. In each episode, we interview other descendants, researchers, and even survivors, sharing stories, memories, and research to build a clearer picture of the past, one that goes beyond the records. Through these conversations, we honor those who suffered and died at Sachsenhausen and strengthen our collective understanding of our own ancestors' experiences. This interview is about Jan Pikna. Jan was born on the 24th of February 1919 in Sebranice, nowadays Czechia. In 1939, he was a 20-year-old student at Masaryk University in Brno, in occupied Protactorate Böhmen and Mähren. In the early morning of November 17, 1939, the Gestapo rounded up Jan along with 1,122 students from Prague, Brno and Pribram, and deported them to Sachsenhausen. He was imprisoned at Sachsenhausen until his release on December 22, 1942. Today, Kelsey and Jakob are speaking with Jan's grandson, Jan Pikna.
Thank you for joining us today. And can you please start with saying who you are related to, your name, who you're related to, and who was the prisoner who was in Sachsenhausen?
All right. Thank you for having me. My name is Jan Pikna. I'm from Czech Republic in Europe, and I'm a descendant of Jan Pikna. He was named same as I am, who was imprisoned in Sachsenhausen camp between 1939 and 1942.
Can you tell us who he was and what his life was like before he came to Sachsenhausen?
He came to the concentration camp as a university student. He was a freshman in his first year. He was 20 years old. He came from a small village from rather poor conditions. And as he didn't like the life of everyone living around him, being, farmers or doing this small farming, he wanted to do something else for himself. And he always liked to work with kids. So his ambition was to become a teacher. So despite being from poor conditions in the environment of so-called First Republic we had, there was a period of democracy and freedom we had in Czechoslovakia between wars. Even he, from poor conditions, was able to study. So he took his chances and came to Brno, that's the second biggest city of Czech Republic, to study at the university. But after some riots we had on our National Day, in the moment when we were already occupied by Nazis, the Nazis decided to close all the universities and took some of the students as sort of hostages and transported them to concentration camps to have a better control over elites and intellectuals in occupied Czechoslovakia.
What was the name of the university?
Nowadays it's Masaryk University in Brno. I think it was also back then, but in the period of communist times, of course, it was not named by Masaryk because he was forbidden. But that's Masaryk University. Also the university I've graduated in. So
You and your grandfather went to the same school?
Yeah.
Okay. So the same school that he was taken by the Nazis from, you were in the same school?
Yeah. It's, not that unique. Not so many universities in Czech Republic anyway. So it's quite close to my hometown. But I didn't study teaching. I never wanted to really be a teacher.
So what year was it when he was in university and this happened? And how old was he?
He was 20 years old. The university year started in September 1939 and in November 1939. And on 17th of November in the early morning, SS ran into the dormitories and shouted everyone out without clothing and everything, just in their pajamas or night clothes. And when they assembled outside, they were gathered together, not told anything, and moved quickly through buses and trains. First to Prague, where majority of students joined the train, and then elsewhere, they didn't know where. And by the midnight, they managed to get to Sachsenhausen camp. And only then they were told that they were sentenced for 3 years and that they are in concentration camps. So they were still, with their hopes, that they would be able to study for the exam they will be taking next week. And in that moment, they realized that they are in concentration camp. Most of them didn't know what concentration camp is. Only day after, they were allowed to write template message to their families. Everyone the same message that they are all right, they are in Sachsenhausen, and that they are not allowed to receive any letters in that moment. So at least their families finally found out where they are and what happened to them. Some of them died on the way already. Some of them were executed as being suspected from being with resistance or being with communist movements, being somehow related to the riots which happened on the National Day on 28th of October, the month before. So they came frightened and not knowing anything to the camp.
What was that date that they arrived at the camp?
After the midnight between 17th and 18th, I think 18th of November. And then they were moved to so-called smaller camp. That's the blocks on the right side from the main entrance gate, where in that period there were Jews, I think, stored, but somehow probably the blocks where they were intended to, which were blocks number 50, 51, 52, and 53, they were not ready yet. Or some explanation says that it was some sort of obligatory quarantine period, that they had to stay there simply for a month or so, or less than a month, 2 weeks or something. They were in these blocks in smaller camp, and then they were moved to another part of the camp.
Right. If Sachsenhausen is a very particular shape, it's a triangle, and at the bottom right foot of the triangle was the small camp that was pretty much the camp for Jewish prisoners. And I've also heard that has become a quarantine area for prisoners, or a transition area for when they first arrived.
Yeah,
and
probably.
Something that's kind of special is that the prisoner that you're related to, your grandfather and my great uncle, were in the same barrack at the same time when he arrived.
I can just imagine, the different psychological status they had, because your great uncle probably was experienced prisoner by that time. He knew, the stuff and what are the risks, what is possible. But, the students, which were all very young, they came frightened and not knowing anything. There is a lot of memoirs from them depicting the first days in the smaller camp. And the first I recall is that, they got in the early morning for a breakfast this kind of concentration camp soup, which was disgusting and smelled awfully, and they were unable to eat it. But then the guards tell them, if you want to eat it, the others will. So they gave it to the other prisoners in the blocks and in surrounding blocks. So maybe also to the Macs, who willingly came and eat it at the time. And the students were surprised how anyone could eat it, and how come that these people who are eating it so eagerly. How could they be so slim like a skeletons, in so desperate conditions? And only the days after they realized why, that this camp is actually not a normal prison.
Yeah, I read the accounts of Leon Salet, who was in the barrack next to Barrack 40, where Janek had arrived. And Leon Salet was looking out the window, and in his book called Experiment E, He describes looking out the window. He was with a particular group of Polish Jewish prisoners who were confined to their barrack. They weren't allowed to leave, so they saw the whole world outside of their window. He describes the conditions of the existing prisoners who were allowed to move around, which would have been my ancestor Max, and they just looked like skeletons walking, shuffling their feet. Their bodies were like dragged all over to do whatever task. And then he described when these Czech students arrived, and he said they were so lively and doing exercises outside, and they just looked like the perfect vision of strength and like a great attitude. And it was such a contrast.
Yeah, that's one of the surprising things I've learned only after I visited the memorial and the site of Sachsenhausen, and I learned about all the context which my grandfather didn't give me, or I didn't ask for it until the moment he died, and now I don't have this chance anymore. It was this, that not all the prisoners were equal, that there was sort of hierarchy, and that the Czech student prisoners were in many aspects in a very different position. First of all, they were young, at the top of their physical strengths and mental strengths, of course, and they were not that easily to be broken mentally, because they wanted to live. They were in the beginning of their life. Some of them, they had their girlfriends, they had their family somewhere, so they willingly really want to survive. Also, they were told that the sentence is time limited, that it's supposed to be 3 years, and that's something which none of other groups of prisoners in Sachsenhausen, as far as I know, had. So this sort of idea that one day they will be released, which eventually happened in the end. And the other aspect was that they were, luckily for them, still kept together. They were never displaced into different blocks, but these 4 blocks I mentioned from 50 to 53, they were student blocks for most of the imprisonment. So they could help each other. There was amazing solidarity among them. They didn't mix, at least in the beginning, with other prisoners that easily. They had other advantages as well, because probably it was sort of an emotional call from Hitler or the Nazis, to imprison them. It seems that both Sachsenhausen as a place was not ready to host them, and also the idea about what to do with them was not there. So for first couple of months until the March of 1940, they were not going for any work details, and they stayed only in the camp. So, they were still thinking, okay, so maybe this was it, and now they will release us. And some of them were released already by the Christmas between 1939 and 40, but most of them stayed. By the way, about the numbers, it's funny, but until nowadays, there is no certainty about how many of Czech students were imprisoned in Sachsenhausen, because the evidence from Sachsenhausen ended up in Moscow. That's one of the problems. The other one is that a lot of evidence lists were simply discarded by the end of the war. And the third reason is that some of the students, they had different statuses, because some of them were Jews, and they were killed immediately in November when they arrived. And some of them were communists, so they were treated like political instead. Students themselves, they tried to make a list of imprisoned students, and one of them managed to smuggle the list suit in the belt when he was released.
Wow.
But then, they came back to still occupy Czechoslovakia, so they were frightened, and this particular student was frightened that much, that, the Gestapo would be after them and, searching their houses and property, so he decided to destroy the list anyway. And after the war, he tried to recall most of the names, but still, it's not certain. But some of the scholars try to count the number, and the most reliable number is 1,122 of Czech students. Slovaks were released because Slovakia was back then an allied country to Hitler, right? So it was only Czechs, and since they were young and they had this sort of privilege or special situations, special standing in hierarchy, as I mentioned, it was only around, now I don't remember exactly, but around 25 of them who died, actually. They were successful in surviving.
success in surviving those statistics, those numbers.
And there is one amazing aspect I realized when we were together in the memorial, that actually, because all of them were, young and they were educated, and after the war, they usually, finished their degrees and, started their careers, if they were allowed by communists. Most of them, some way or another, wrote or recorded their memoirs. There is like tens of books in Czech written by these prisoners in 60s, 70s, 80s, and even nowadays there are new books or memoirs being published as, their descendants are finding the old yellow papers somewhere in the cellar, and they are publishing it. So there's still new memoirs coming in. And that's amazing and maybe unique source of information because, for most of the people who were imprisoned in Sachsenhausen, this was actually the terminus. They didn't have a chance to disseminate the message afterwards, or not that many. So I realized that actually it could be these Czech students who could be source of a lot of information and knowledge about the Sachsenhausen. So I'm trying now to collect as many books as possible. They are, by the way, very cheap because.
Wow, I see you're holding up these different books.
I have already 20 of different books of students who wrote their memoirs, and there is a lot of notes about other prisoners, and not only about Czech students, but also about German communists, about Jews. Sometimes, not that frequently, because with Jews they were a bit of detached.
Yeah, they were segregated.
Yeah, there is notes about particular and named Norwegians, Dutch, French. So that's a lot of interesting stories. I was able to look it up in these books. So these books can help a lot and imagine how these people lived actually, what they went through. So good source of knowledge, and I was given to the specific situation these Czech students were in Sachsenhausen.
Many descendants of prisoners do not have the information about their family member and their time at Sachsenhausen because that prisoner might not have told the story, that prisoner might have died in the camp. That information gets lost over time, and to have all of those books and sources is really precious information.
There is one interesting story I could tell you briefly if you want to, because that's just something I would like to make a movie about. There was one of the students, he was actually a schoolmate of my grandfather from Brno, and he ended up on the Appelplatz in this morning of 18th of November beside all the other students, being told that, they are sentenced for 3 years. His name was Pavel Svoboda. Svoboda means freedom, by the way. That's very interesting in this case, because soon after, when the Christmas was approaching on 22nd of December of 1939, SS officer came to them, only to Czech students, and asked who is sick, or who is ill, step in front. And in that moment, all of them were afraid because they felt that, if they would show, weakness, they would be killed right away. But this Pavel Svoboda decided to took a risk, and he stepped out, even though he was fine. And these 35 people who stepped out, after all, were actually released the same day. It was after the pressure of some of the families back in Czechoslovakia, or maybe by the Protactorate president we had. He was sort of a puppet president, but he was trying to negotiate with Hitler, of the releasement of some in occasion of Christmas. And this Pavel Svoboda was released and came after 1 month of stay in Sachsenhausen back home. And probably everyone normal would stay low profile and quiet for the rest of the war, happy that he just survived and get out of this hell. Not this guy, who decided to secretly went through the borders, through Hungary and Balkans to Lebanon and Syria, where he joined the British Army. Then he got transferred to France, and when France was taken by Hitler, he moved to Britain, where he joined Royal Air Force, becoming a pilot of bomber, and started to raid Berlin and other cities with his bomber, with his Wellington, and remembering that he was flying over Sachsenhausen camp, which was well recognizable from the top, as it has this triangle shape. remembering all his fellows and schoolmates who are still in there, actually. He was very active in London because he started a campaign of international recognition of this attack on students, which happened on 17th of November, and he actually managed recognition of 17th of November as International Students' Day, which is really widely recognized holiday on most of the world, and in Czech Republic particularly, it's national holiday, 17th of November since then. So it was because of him. But the story is not over, because once returning back from the mission, and by the way, yeah, he got married in Edinburgh with some Scot woman, and when he was returning back from one of the missions above the Netherlands, they were shot down and ended up in the sea. They survived 7 days in this emergency boat, being rescued afterwards by Nazis by the coast of Netherlands and imprisoned in Czechoslovakia, actually. So they brought him back to Czechoslovakia in one of the detention camps as a pilot. They didn't really connect him with the prisoner from the Sachsenhausen, so they didn't return him back to Sachsenhausen, but he was in these work details in some camps in Czechoslovakia. But soon after, he managed to escape and joined the guerrilla fighters in the mountains, fighting Nazis until the end of the war. And then after the war, he returned back to Scotland, where he realized that he has a son, which was born in the meantime. So there is an amazing story of this kind of prisoner from Sachsenhausen who paid his debts perfectly to the Nazis. And I think if Hollywood would search for a motive for a movie, this is perfect one, because there is everything. There is shouting dogs on the Appelplatz in the morning. There is a boat scene on the sea. There is escape in the forest and guerrilla fighting with partisans, with guerrilla fighters. Amazing.
And romance.
Yeah, and there's romance. Yeah.
Surprise children. Wow. And he was a classmate of your grandfather's, but a friend.
I think they must have.
They're classmates. That's good enough. It doesn't matter.
Yeah.
The story's amazing.
I think he studied law or something, so they probably didn't know each other that much, and they didn't spend so much time in the camp together. But it's nice that he, in his memoir, said that he had this sentiment flying over this triangle of Sachsenhausen and remembering his fellow prisoners.
Yeah. What, going back to your grandfather, do you know his prisoner number?
It's actually funny because he had 3 of them.
Really?
Yeah, that's quite unique, I think. And also the people in archive of the memorial were surprised.
Did he ever say why he had 3 numbers?
I don't remember him speaking about it ever, but I think it was because of the administrative reasons. Because all of the students who were imprisoned, they had 2 numbers because they were imprisoned in 1939. Back then, the number used to have 4 digits. But then in 1941, I think the system changed and they got 5 digits number. So the original number of my grandfather was 4,768. He had it only for a month. And when they were moved from this quarantine of the smaller camp to block number 51, he got 4,794. In this end of 1940, beginning of 1941, he got this 14,722, and that's the number he had for the rest of his stay in the camp.
What did he do while he was at Sachsenhausen?
That's something I know because he used to talk about it, and also I found it in some letters to his friends I'm in possession of from the times afterwards when he was older, and reminding of these times. He used to work in a shoe factory that's in Industriehof. That's on the left side of the triangle. He used to work as electrician, despite he didn't have a training or knowledge in this. Usually the practice was, as I understood from the memoirs, that on the morning Appel...
In the roll call area, in the Appelplatz.
Yeah, and they were searching for specific capacities or knowledge, who is a mason, who is an electrician, who is a plumber, and people who wanted to change their work detail because, it was dangerous or too physically demanding. They simply said, yeah, I'm a perfect electrician. And then they had to overnight, got trained by fellow prisoners on the block to show that, they're capable of something. So probably that's the story of my grandfather, because he was never really electrician, because his father was a farmer. And so he learned something and worked in this sense. One story I remember telling him when I was a kid, it was that he was ordered to deconstruct, destroy some concrete construction. Not sure the detail. Actually, I think he was telling me he was, digging a ditch, from it actually. So it was a ground probably. And he only was given a hammer, but he wasn't given any chisel. So he dared to ask the SS guard officer actually, who was, passing by, if he could maybe get a chisel that he would be faster with his work and it would be more effective. And the officer just looked at him and hit him into his face so hard that he lost his teeth. He got teeth replaced by golden after the war, and he always showed me the teeth, the golden one he got after this incident with SS officer. He worked on klinkerwerk as well in this brick works by the camp.
The clinker work has a very particular reputation as being one of the places that the prisoners feared for how brutal and deadly it was as a place to work. Did he talk about his experience there?
Not particularly. Maybe because he knew that we don't know what the klinkerwerk was, so he just described the atrocities in general and not in particular. But now, when I'm recalling this, what he said about this, the construction of concrete facility with a hammer, that's something which sounds very familiar with the memoirs of other students who worked in klinkerwerk, because that's what they were doing very often. I think it's also depicted in one of the pictures in klinkerwerk, Czech students, trying to deconstruct some older concrete construction, because as I understood, the purpose of klinkerwerk was changing several times through the course of the war. First, it was simply a port, then it became really a brickworks. After some period, it became really a place where SS was producing things which were needed and which they were able to sell, because it was economic profit which was actually running this particular facility. And in the end, it was sort of armory, or they were constructing some parts for planes or something, or bombs or whatever. So they were reconstructing it all the time, changing the purpose of something, replacing oven for another facility and stuff like that. But yeah, besides, memoirs of students confirmed that this was an awful place. This was a place of extermination of especially Jews and Polish. There was a special detachment of this Strafkompanie. There was this people who were sentenced for bad behavior. They were sentenced to Strafkompanie. And the Strafkompanie's work detail was usually klinkerwerk, and they were not expected to come back from this work detail. So they were beaten to death or given the worst work details. There was sort of a sentence. So that was the place of biggest atrocities. It was the first work detail of Czech students where they went in this March 1940. And immediately they realized that this is the place where they will only die. So most of them were searching for another work details and trying to, sell, that they have skills.
Like an electrician?
Yeah, or, these who were really students of engineering or technologies, they were right away transported to Mauthausen, for instance, because, the Mauthausen was in development back then, and they needed experts to extend, the facility. So some of the students were also sent elsewhere because, the specific job they've done. Or one of the students was actually a painter originally, like a painter of the flats, and he was ordered to paint a flat of Reinhard Heydrich in Berlin. So he did the decoration with the oak leaves and deers there, and met his wife and his children. So this kind of jobs they were ordered as well.
Wow.
Yeah.
What kind of communication did your grandfather receive from his family?
Here again, I think it was different from prisoners group to other. By the way, when we were in Memorial, I understood that there was a system in the shape of the triangle of the camp and the streets sort of where the blocks were actually. Because if you imagine the Sachsenhausen, right, there is Appelplatz in front, and then as the triangle goes further, there are like lines or semicircles of blocks. So the first semicircles were for Germans who were like Germans, so still quite respectful prisoners, but they were communists or leftists, or I don't know actually where antisocials were or where homosexuals were, but I think we were told, and I think that's also described in memoirs of Czech students, Germans were generally treated as, valuable prisoners. Then there was Norwegians, they were also of this Aryan blood, so also they were like well treated. And for instance, Norwegians, as far as I learned from the memoirs of Czech students, were allowed to keep their hair. So they were not shaved. And then there were Czechs. I don't know why Czechs were treated better than Polish, but then they were Polish only afterwards. Maybe because we used to be part of Holy Roman Empire, or we had similar history with Germans, or I don't know, we didn't fight the occupation, but Polish did. On the lower part of the, scale of hierarchy was Jews, Soviet prisoners. Czechs at least, they were allowed to write home like twice a month. Actually, which is quite a lot, I think.
Yeah.
And also receiving the letters. In one moment, I don't remember actually the date, but I think it was something like the moment when they started to go for work details, so something like spring 1940, they were allowed to receive packages from home. Of course, in the letters, and luckily I'm in possession of nearly all of letters my grandfather wrote from the concentration camp to my grandmother. So that's a treasure I have, because it's written in German, of course, so the censorship office can read it through, whether there is no details about how they suffer and stuff. So usually he's not able to say anything about himself. He says that he's healthy. Sometimes he says that he's not healthy.
He was allowed to say, "I am not healthy."
Yeah, but I think in some minor aspect that he's having a cough or something like that. But besides, he's asking about the people in the village, the people in the family. In one of the letters, actually, there is a drawing in the left top corner, and the letter is actually a congratulation for the wedding of his sister. And the drawing, I'm definitely sure it was not done by himself, because he was not a drawer, really. But back then, there were, among another Czech prisoners, which are not students, but other Czech prisoners, there was one famous artist, painter, Josef Čapek, who was a cubist painter. And might be because they were in the same block that he was an author. I'm not sure, but he could have been the author of the drawing. Yeah, he was keeping in touch with the family. Family knew very well that he's still alive, and this time frame of one letter every 2 weeks, gave them a good chance that their son or relative is allowed or able to write, and he's in good condition. That was not that cruel, like in case of other groups of prisoners which were not allowed to receive any letters, and they were just by themselves, in this cruel world.
Yeah, it makes such a big difference what you just described, that your grandfather could have frequent communication and have love and support.
Yep.
And like loving messages from him with his family, and that drawing that wasn't from him, which means somebody cared enough with him to make this drawing, to make this letter extra special. That means he had friends inside near him.
Keeping hope, think that he's not alone, and that he will probably get out of this, and that the world outside still exists. That was something very valuable. By the way, there is maybe one thing interesting which comes out from the memoirs of Czech students, especially those who were transported to the Sachsenhausen, who are these electricians or the technologies experts, because they then could compare, because most of them ended up in Auschwitz in the end. And then they were released from Auschwitz. So, but they experienced also the Auschwitz thing. And then they could compare Mauthausen, Auschwitz, and Sachsenhausen. One moment, one of them told that, the difference was actually that, and I never talked about this with any expert or archivist, but it makes sense to me, that in Sachsenhausen concentration camp, there was a very strong role of prisoner self-governance.
Yes.
And that the role of self-governance in Sachsenhausen was played mainly by politic prisoners and not the criminals, because it was either other way around in other concentration camps, or there might have not been any self-governance at all. I think in some sub-camps of Auschwitz, for instance, because there was no point in it, because, the people were, not really staying for long, simply. But here probably it was the tradition, that it was one of the oldest concentration camps in Germany. it was definitely dedicated especially to political prisoners. There were criminals as well. There were other groups definitely, but it started with the inner enemies of Nazism, from Germany.
Right. There were political opponents were some of the first prisoners at Sachsenhausen. And I've been slowly reading the memoir of Harry Neujoks, who was a communist, one of the earliest prisoners who in 1936 was arrested and helped construct the camp. And he talks about this self-governance, but I'm just reading along, and what you're saying makes sense. He talks about how they met regularly to agree on how to self-govern and how to get along with all these new different kind of societies and social groups who joined the camp, and coming up with a way to keep going.
Yeah, exactly. There is a lot of interesting details about this, because it seems that really it was the political self-governance who made the life livable much more than in other camps in Sachsenhausen, and especially for some groups of prisoners. I don't know the key why they decided, but it seems that Czech students were of a good use for them, because they were capable workforce. Really, they were funny, because they started to play music. There was a case of my grandfather, because they started a choir in the block, and they made concerts. Also, actually, in one moment for the guards, because also it was sort of accepted by the SS that this is actually increasing the motivation and sort of a good atmosphere in the camp. So this was something in the end supported. Somehow it seems that they made the life livable much more. And it seems that they were actually quite influential, because some of the Czech students remember in their memoirs that, for instance, since 1941, the communist self-governance had their own radio transmitter hidden in infirmary dysentery department, where guards were afraid to come because dysentery was quite infectious. So under the ground there was a hidden radio transmitter, and they were able to transmit information outside of the camp, for instance.
Using the radio, they were able to transmit.
Yeah. At least that's said by the students. I never read about it anywhere else than in these memoirs. But these particular students said that as they became communist inside the camp, they sort of converted into communism under the influence of these older political prisoners from Germany. They were involved in this kind of secret thing. So that's quite interesting.
What happened with your grandfather's release? How was he released?
It has to be a quite depressing process, because usually the release of Czech students came on the birthday of Adolf Hitler or on the Christmas. There were like two regular occasions when they could count that some of them would be released, probably. Sometimes the release took 150 of them, sometimes it was 20. There was no logic in it. Actually, only now, in some of the recent books, we found out that actually this didn't happen by generosity of Nazis, but it was by heavy negotiation of this Czech occupation government and president himself. And usually it was paid for expensive price, because, for instance, for every Hitler's birthday, our president has to publish a congratulation article in all the newspapers in Protactorate, and that was the payment for release of 20 students, for instance. And then if the Czech resistance was suppressed and peaceful for some time, we were given another student hostages back again. So it was connected with the political situation in the Protectorate in the Czechoslovakia, and there was no really logic in it. And for my grandfather, he saw a lot of his friends leaving, but he was there until the very, very end. He really managed this 3-year sentence as one of the few, actually. I think it was like 60 of them out of this 1,100 who were there even after these 3 years sentence. And soon after, 3 years and 1 month after, he was released as well. It was before the Christmas of 1942, together with another tense. And that was probably the end of Czech students in Sachsenhausen. I think only 5 of them remained, but that was due to some administrative mistake, and they were released afterwards. So in the end, it was this lengthy process, and he was one of the latest. So he really enjoyed the full course of that. Yeah.
Yeah, that must have been an impactful thing to see your strong community and kind of support system go away.
But there is one thing I forgot to mention as to his work details. He told me when I was a kid that he had a sort of exemption because he could have unsewed pockets in his jacket due to his role as a translator. He spoke French and German very well, so he could have played this sort of translating role. I asked by the memorial if they could describe me, what role could that be. They told me that translators were usually used by the prisoner self-governance during the entrance procedure of new prisoners because, they had to ask them about their details and write everything on a typewriter. He was a big typewriter, actually, my grandfather, so it might be that he learned at the camp, actually. So he probably played this role, and he told me that this unsewed pocket gave him advantage of smuggling some potatoes to fellow prisoners on the block when he was screwing potatoes in the kitchen and then, bringing them in the pocket, which was, of course, not allowed, but unseen and then possible.
So his privilege was to have pockets in his uniform.
Yeah. Because, that there's also interesting thing because when the students came, they were given old uniforms, actually. I think it was old German uniforms or maybe even French uniforms from the 19th century. Different groups of different prisoners got, different sort of uniforms because, in one moment the Nazis were running out of the material and they used everything they had for the front. So there is even a moment, and it was in one of his letters home, that prisoners could ask their families to send some winter clothing. So he received a pullover from their parents, and that's in memoirs very often that, since then, I don't know the year, maybe 1942 probably, since then the prisoners, everyone looked different because, they simply had the different clothing since then.
He was allowed to receive and wear a pullover in the camp.
Yeah, but actually in that point, it was most of the prisoners because simply the Nazis didn't have enough winter equipment for everyone, so they allowed them to ask for sending the winter equipment because everything was sent to the front to Wehrmacht. That was probably the moment of this cruel winter in Eastern Front in Russia when everything Nazis had, they were sending there, so they didn't have enough for prisoners.
I guess I'm just thinking of the very few records from Jewish prisoners in the small camp. They're wearing their sin summer clothing all winter long. There was no ability to wear any other kind of clothing. It's remarkable.
It was, I think, similar for Czech students in the beginning because this frosty Appelplatz in January 1940, which is famous because, they were held standing for a couple of hours and hundreds of them froze to death.
It was remarkably cold and used as a death-awaited kill.
As remembered by Czech students back then, they only had their normal jackets. They didn't have any coats yet. I think that they were given afterwards, maybe in February. But in January, they were not. So they were really freezing to death. And there was one incident afterwards. That was in the beginning of February, because in one of the blocks where students were, I think it was number 53, in the morning, when they were assembling for the Appelplatz, one of the students in block 53 was late. Somehow he took his time, and one of the guards saw it, and he became angry. So he ordered all of the students from the block to go in front of the block and lay down. They lay down on the grass, and the other prisoners from other block got the shovels and had to cover them with snow. That there was a moat of snow of a couple of meters, and they had to stay there for a couple of hours, and only then they were allowed to be digged out. And a couple of students died after this incident because they were frozen and got fever soon after. So that was one of the cruel incidents of SS guards playing with the prisoners.
Yeah.
That's a thing full of paradox because on one hand, they were allowed to write letters by obligation, Czech students at least, but I think that was for all of the previous students or prisoners. They had to buy Nazi newspapers every week or every morning. They could buy extra stuff in canteen shop, where there were insignificant things like hair pomade, while they were, shaved, so, what for? But on the other hand, the guards could, deliberately kill them anytime.
Right.
But on the other hand, when my grandfather was released, He got all his clothing from November 39 back in perfect shape. On one point, there was this system and there was this nice face of, trying to show that, this could be a normal prison and you can actually have some extra things and you can, if you behave well, and some sort of a carrot. But on the other hand, the SS guards were violent, cruel, and they could kill you, not even needing to writing or filling in any papers, just, because they felt like that. That's full of paradox, really.
Tell us about his release. Like, was he transported from the camp? How did he get home? Or where did he go?
Usually they were told in the morning appel. So that was probably the case also of my grandfather. And their names were read and they were allowed to come back to the block.
Their names were just called out, announced.
They went straight to this Efferkammer. I think that's sort of a storage of clothing. There they got the clothes and all the possession they used to have, probably not valuables because they were stolen, but maybe if they had their ID, probably they were given it back. Also, my grandfather, I remember he told me that it smelled with the naphthalene, with the chemicals, because, they wanted to conservate it, so it smelled very badly, and it was, folded, so, there were folders everywhere, so it was very visible. Despite he would be released, he had a head shaved while he had 190 centimeters. I'm not sure how is it in American measures, but he was quite tall.
Okay.
He had 40 kilograms. That's very...
Very thin.
So he was pretty much a skeleton.
Yeah.
With a shaved hand and with the clothes which were, folded and smelly. Like that, he was released together with tens of other Czech students, and they were guarded from the camp to Oranienburg, the train station. So, among the civilian people, they could have seen the normal life. Probably, usually, that's in memoirs of other students. People knew very well what's happening in the camp, and they were shouting on them and wishing them quick death and throwing stones on them on the way. And then they ended up in the train station in Oranienburg, and the guard waited until they boarded the train to Berlin, because it's S-Bahn, so it's this suburban connection. And then in Berlin Hauptbahnhof, he changed for the train to Czech Republic. They went through Ústí nad Labem, and I think to Prague, and from Prague to Brno. On the way, some of the students said farewell and went out as they were closer to their home, but he needed to go to Moravia. And in Brno, they had to go straight away to Gestapo headquarters to got written in their evidence. So by paradox, actually, he went to the Faculty of Law, which was the headquarters of Gestapo during the course of the war in Brno. So the place where he actually had his entrance ceremony as a student the month before he was imprisoned. There he was signed as a released prisoner. He was instructed that he's not allowed to tell anyone about what happened in Sachsenhausen, and that if he tells anyone, he will immediately be brought back. And he got his evidence list of releasement, and he was sent home. And of course, because there was this obligation of working during the course of Second World War, he immediately starts to search for a job. His father worked at a train company, national train company back then, so that was his first intention. But then he found that in the town where he studied secondary school, there was a factory making uniforms for Wehrmacht. So he applied there, and as he spoke the languages, he worked in the office as a translator until the end of the war.
Wow. And did he talk about that?
During the war, I guess he did. There's an interesting story, because in the factory, there was also my grandmother working, and they got to know each other during the war and fallen in love and decided that they will get married just when the war is over. So probably, at least to her, he had to tell the stories. My grandmother, by the way, was working with the siren.
Oh, the siren. Yeah, the alarm.
Emergency sign in case of the bombing. So she used to tell me that sometimes by the end of the war, they made the emergency alarm despite there was no bombing. So all the Nazis, all the Germans came to the dungeons, to the cellars, to be protected, and they started to destroy the machines and the uniforms. They're tearing them down, and then they came also to the shelters, and when the alarm was called out, the Nazis found out that the work is destroyed, but couldn't find the victim because everyone was in the shelters.
Wow.
They got married really in July 1945 in Olomouc. That's the third of all biggest in Czech Republic. So they fall in love during the war. That was nice.
How has this story affected your family's life?
It was always present, the subject, I think, because my grandfather came from the war, probably influenced mentally, because in 50s it turned out that he has bipolar disorder. That's this moment when your mind is changing from Jekyll to Hyde without any...
Bipolar, so it really flips from different feelings.
Yeah. So he had this moment of maniacal happiness when he was making poems and giving everyone flowers and spending money with sort of depression and aggression as well, unfortunately. And that's probably, while I can't dedicate it only to Sachsenhausen stay, but it makes sense that it could be a result of some post-traumatic problem you could have encountered there. This continuous suffering, seeing your friends leaving, being released, and you staying there and being a witness of all the atrocities, and it became a problem. But on the other hand, he was never shy about it. He always told people around him after the war what he was through, and he was proud about it. Also, the students, they stayed together even after the release and after the war. They started community sort of association. It was difficult then with communists taking over, because then they wanted to see their only students which were active in Communist Party as well. Some of them were, the others were not. And my grandfather, he was a Christian, and he originally applied for a membership in the Communist Party in 1945, but after 1 month or so, he actually discarded his application, and that was actually worse than if he wouldn't ever apply. Because if he would apply and then discard it, that means that you made yourself a pronounced enemy of the regime. So he had a bad situation with the regime, and he was not allowed to finish his studies. So he had to work as an officer until his death, and on not that well-paid jobs, despite he had intellectual capacities to do something else. And also a difficult aspect was that with my grandmother, they actually had 8 kids. So they were very poor, taking care of 8 kids, being, Christians, having not very well-paid jobs, being against the regime. So it was a difficult situation, and he was mentioning this fact that he suffered in concentration camp very often in the moment when he could get any compassion or advantage from it. Not that I would say that it was a bad thing, but because he didn't have that much cards in his hand anyway. That was one of the cards he used to play. That he suffered during the war, which is actually true, and sometimes some people got him something extra from compassion or something like that.
Did he ever file the restitution papers, like that you could do for compensation from Nazi persecution?
Yeah. He received the money, I think. There was one batch in 70s, but I think it was quite difficult with Czechoslovakia and German relations back then, because it was actually not paid by the GDR, by the Eastern German government, by the Western one. And they were not in good relations in diplomatic relations for a long time. So I think there was something in 70s, but after Velvet Revolution and democracy, and when we negotiated the final treaty of understanding with Germany, I think it was in 1997, between Czech Republic and Germany, he received something afterwards, when he was very old already.
Okay.
So he was above 80 years old by then, but that's at least some recognition. And recently, actually last week, I've learned amazing thing, because I've looked again into some letters I got from my aunt, from his daughter actually, and one of these letters was in German and written in year 2000, somewhere by Stuttgart. And as I discussed this letter with Memorial, with the archivists, with Andreas Zimník, and we've learned that actually he was probably in correspondence with some of the Eastern Germans who were finding their sort of a partner prisoner, to keep the relation by letters, to sort of, get over this negative energy and emotions. It was sort of a therapy of denazification in Eastern Germany, probably, that the people were encouraged to write to some of the prisoners somewhere, and my grandfather took part in this. And that's something I'm actually quite grateful. And that's also the imagine I have about him, that he never actually blamed the Germans from this, but blamed the Nazis. And he never really kept the negative emotion about. I mean, of course, he was angry that he had to be there, but there was some sort of forgiveness, or at least ability to go on. And I always admired that he, for instance, he always wanted me to speak German, or to learn German. That that there was not this abandoning of the whole German culture and civilization, which should be insignificant given we are Czech and we are so much interconnected with Germans, and we always were. So that's something that he could get over it, and it seems that he was corresponding with somebody. Also, last thing, I'm talking too much. There is on one of the letters, which is totally unrelated to Sachsenhausen. There is an address of Mr. Bert Zort from Dresden. So I need to find out, because probably he could have been a fellow prisoner, German, or another descendant or somebody corresponding with him. So I need to find out.
It's remarkable that this is 80 years later, and it's still, there are questions and mysteries and just holes of information, and you're making discoveries.
Yeah, it's amazing that I'm still continuing. And last week I found out that actually in one of his letters, he talks with some journalist in 1984 about an article which will be published in November issue of the magazine. So now I'm searching for this particular magazine's issue from November 1980, where it's supposed to be interview with my grandfather. So there's supposed to be maybe some information. Might be that it will be only the things I already know, but it could be that he would be describing some of the stories while being on Klinkerwerk, or what he has done as a translator or something like that.
Why do you continue to be curious about his life and his experience at Sachsenhausen, and what role does that play with you today?
I must say I was always interested, because this is so huge thing, and we had special relation, which might be silly, but out of this 8 children he had, most of them, they were daughters, and he waited for my father actually being a 6th child. So we have good hopes that he will have a continuation of his family. And he saw me, his grandson, as a continuation of the family, having the family name. So we were talking a lot, actually. He spent a lot of time with me particularly. And that's maybe why I always had respect to this chapter of his life. But when I was a kid, of course, I felt, this is so sad, and I always thought that one day I will, dig into it and learn everything. But, it's, so sad. Maybe when I will be in my pension, and I didn't feel I'm ready for it. But in one moment, like 3 years ago, I saw an advertisement of Sachsenhausen Memorial in Facebook, and there was something like, check out our archive. And I was like, it's online or something. I was like, okay, wow. So if it's that simple, if there is an archive, I can, just give it a chance and write, his name and birth date and find out. And I got amazing reply and some of the details. Some things they knew, some things they didn't know. But let's start the search, actually. And soon after, I got invited to the meeting where we 3 met, actually. And since then, I started a bit earlier than I intended. I'm still not in my pension. I have small kids, so not that enough time I would like to dedicate it to this. But on the other hand, I feel the satisfaction that there's still some time to ask some people, because I still have my aunts, my father, his kids who remember some stories. There is the materials, no one throw them away still, so I remember something. So it's actually good that I can start collecting it. All of his kids wanted to do something in their life. They studied at the university, despite by communists they were not allowed originally. They had so good exam results. They were allowed only maybe to be doctors, not to study society or humanistic studies. But all of them were very straightforward, wanting to do something meaningful for life and, really like play a role. Because, that's something that the story actually teaches us. Because, our grandfather became a subject of history despite he didn't intend it to. He was not a resistance fighter. He was not a communist. He didn't got involved. He was just 20 years old boy. And that's, what tells you that actually history affects you despite you want to or not. So it's silly actually to pretend that politics is not there, not going to election because, it's already decided or you wouldn't influence it anyway. You can influence so many things. So, most of my aunts or of my father, they are somehow active in society. They are in politics. They are members of political parties, despite different sometimes. So that's also, for me, there was also a motivation because I always wanted to be active. I also wanted to do something with politics. And actually, that's what I'm doing for a living because I'm working for one of the ministries with European funding. So I always wanted to do something meaningful, so it was not in vain, and it was, so that I can have my influence in this, because if I want influence, a world to be more free, more liberate, more humanistic, it can easily turn to be radical, to be fascist, to be communist again, that, some groups of people would be described as a threat and sorted that way, Back then it was Jews, now it's, migrants, it's Muslims. In some parts of society, in Czech Republic, the Ukrainians are not to be blamed, but that's of course insignificant because they are heroes and they are helping us so much, by working with us. But these patterns are still in the society, and it's so valuable to know this story because I can see the similarities, and it gives me inspiration to keep working on this. Remain humanistic despite it's sometimes difficult when you see some terrorist attack somewhere. But still seeing that it's good and bad people. It's not Germans against Russians or Polish against Czechs or whatever. It's good and bad people.
Thank you for sharing all your knowledge and Janek's story with us today and how it affects you and other descendants today.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you for having me. It was a pleasure.
Descendant Stuff podcast is produced by Jakob Feistauer, Kelsey Snook, and Nicole Wines, 3 descendants of Sachsenhausen prisoners and co-creators of the Sachsenhausen Stuff project. The Descendant Stuff team would like to extend a special thank you to the team at Sachsenhausen Memorial and Museum, especially Dr. Astrid Lai, and the members of the Educational Department's project, What Voice Do We Have?, as well as the Descendants Collective Voices of the Next Generation. The theme song, Heil Sachsenhausen, was written by Alexander Kulisiewicz while he was imprisoned at Sachsenhausen and performed by him after the war. It is used with permission from the United States Holocaust Memorial Museum's Kulisiewicz collection. If you are a Sachsenhausen descendant who would like to share your story, please contact us through our website at www.sachsenhausen-stuff.com or use the Contact Us link in the show notes below.
Heil Sachsenhausen. A jak będę jutro wzdychał lewą nóżką, ci zawtikam. Heil, es lebe Gold, o Kampf.